Hello, so today we'll be going over how to use a motif or pattern through the chord changes. If you recall, in the last video entitled Autumn Leaves Motif number 2, I briefly discussed the use of this pattern through some chord changes in Autumn Leaves. I was asked to further delineate the concept of how to use this pattern through chord changes, or on top of a triad, more specifically. And that's what we'll review today. Just for recollection, I'll play the lick again. That was the lick I used predominantly in the last video. As I gave examples in the last video, you can also play it going up or doing it on top of triads. This is the generic form of the lick in intervals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6. Though, if we want to conform this pattern to the actual scale we're playing, which is A minor, C major, then the pattern goes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 7. This is just a strict notation of how the sequence would come about if we wrote it in direct comparison to the scale that we're playing. I would not advise memorizing it this way, which is why I left it like this in the last video. But just for transparency and some accuracy, I wanted to mention that this would actually be the intervallic enumeration in correlation to the notes that we're playing. So again, like I started on the saxophone just now, I played D going down to C and then B. So D would be the 2 of the C major scale. This here, however, is still how you'd want to memorize it, because the idea is to have a slew of different patterns in your memorization, in your playing, but you don't necessarily want to have to memorize all the string of numbers, because this is going to change. In a brief moment, I'm going to enumerate the rest of the pattern just so we can get a visual. But it will get more complicated as you go on if you try to adjust the numbers, and especially do that mentally. What you ought to do is just have this pattern in your head and in your fingers and be able to transpose it basically throughout the horn. So I'm going to put my saxophone down and enumerate the rest of that pattern. So, as I just covered, this would be the D pattern. So if we put the letter names to these intervals, then we have D, F, G, A, C, and B. Those are the notes we're playing. So that's the D pattern, which is number 1. So I can put a 1 here and put a D here. Then we go on number 2. I'm going downward, so we're going down to C. So this C pattern, that would actually be this here. That can be looked at as exactly the same. So that would actually, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6 would be the C pattern. So that's our C pattern, which goes C, D, E, F, G, B, Now that's our C pattern there. Okay, now we have the third pattern, which is the B pattern. Now the B pattern would then be starting on the 7. On this tenor saxophone, that would be low B. We're starting on the 7, going to the 1, then the 2, then the 3, then the 4, and then the 6, and then the 5. So if you look carefully here, and I'll put the letter names here also. Let's see. So if we look closely, we can see that there's a pattern at every numerical order or even letter, right? So it's stepping down as we play in the series. So we have a 7, then this 7 becomes a 6, and that 6 becomes a 5, right? So everything should be matching, and that's a way to check this. If you're doing this, on a piece of paper, if you want to write this down, then that would be a way to check your work, right? So we can go down the line and see that the number progressively will get smaller, right? Or it's actually, it's descending. So there's 4 to 3 to 2, 5 to 4 to 3, 6 to 5 to 4, 8 to 7 to 6, 7, 6 to 5. All right. So that's the pattern. And I wanted to also make a note of why I'm starting at D. Well, for one reason, there's a 2-5-1 that happens in the song that has a D minor in it. So D minor is played all throughout the form of Autumn Leaves. That's number one. Number two is I actually just tend to like to start a lot of phrases at the bottom of the horn or near the bottom of the horn. So that's really why. There's not really too much of a theoretical reason why, other than the fact, as I mentioned, that it's playing off a D minor. But I also just like to play phrases in that register. This is something important that I wanted to bring up, because sometimes we talk about playing through the phrases or playing through the changes. A lot of times we get hung up thinking that we have to play a certain thing at a certain time always, and that's not really the case. And that's part of why I wanted to show you this lick, because I'm really playing this lick because I like it, because I like the way it sounds over the music, and because I like the way it sounds on the horn. And what I'm trying to do is make it conform to the changes, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on how strict I want to be, right? So in the last video, you saw me do it against that E7, accentuating that G minor note. That was a moment where I was trying to really form it to the changes and play strictly to the changes. You're not always doing that all the time, but you can if you want to. We have to remember that playing strictly to the changes also gives you a certain sound. It's also a certain stylistic thing. So if that's not what you're going for necessarily, then you don't have to always do it all the time, because that's going to dictate how you sound. If you don't want to sound like that, then you don't want to play like that, right? There's some players that play a lot of arpeggios, right? And they play the arpeggio of every chord change. Some of them outline it with enclosures, all right? Some will use sequences like this, like I'm showing you here. But now what I also wanted to show you was how to take this pattern and adapt it to a triad. If you wanted to play this strictly on top of a triad, over the chord that's passing by in the music, or the chord that you're anticipating to come in the music. So just to review again, this is the pattern starting from D to C to B. So it's a descending pattern. We can call this one a descending pattern. Again, why did I choose to do that? I chose to do it because I liked it. There's no real theoretical reason why. I like the way it sounds, so I did it. You can do it up or you can do it down. You know, I liked it playing it like this, so that's just the way I did it. Now, as I showed you in the last video, you can also make it conform to the D minor triad. So here I was just saying, okay, the triad is a D minor 7, so I'm just going to start on D and I'm going to make a motif and a sequence based on that note, but not on the triad, just on that note. But you can also play it more specific to the triad. So how would I do that? Well, I would take that pattern and adapt it to the notes of the triad, D, F, A. So as you can see from here and here, there's a difference, right? Because again, here I was just going descending. Now I'm saying to myself, okay, let's play it in terms of the triad that I'm playing, all right? Now you could also put the 7 here, but we're just not going to worry about it for right now. That could be something you can figure out if you want to put the 7 on top and play the whole chord. But right now we're just going to focus on the triad. So because it's the same process. From there, any kind of extension or alteration, you do the same thing. So if we're going to start on the D, then we'd have that same pattern. Remember, our pattern is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6 pattern. If we adapt that to the scale, then we have, this will be the second note. So this would be, D would be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 7. Now, if we start on F, F is the 4, right, of C. So we have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, now we can call this a 10. We can call this a 10 or a 3. I'll put the 3 in parentheses. And a 9, and I'll put a 2 in parentheses. Because right now, because once we go up this high, we're playing in the octave range, right? So especially in jazz, we often would call that the 10 or the 9. So it's basically the octave of the 3 and the octave of the 2. So that would be our pattern for F. Now we do our pattern for A, where A would be the 6th. So the 6th would be as follows. So we start on 6, then go to 7, 8, the 9th would be the 2nd, the 10th, which would be the 3rd, the 12th, and then the 11th. The 12th being the 5, and the 11 being the 4. So that would be our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6 pattern adapted to the D minor arpeggio. Again, I'm just enumerating this out just so we can see what's going on. I wouldn't expect you to memorize it in this fashion. You want to memorize this. This is really what you want. That's what you want to memorize, but if we're doing it on paper, and if I asked you to say, write this down, if I asked you to write this down, then that's what it should look like. You should be able to do this, to just transpose this enumeration through any scale or any arpeggio. So that's the scale, or that's the motif on the D minor 7. And I'll grab my saxophone and play that. So remember, and you're going to hear also that there's not too much of a difference here. That's also what I wanted to mention about this, is that you'll hear me play the descending pattern, and then you'll hear me play it over the D minor. And they're relatively close except for the ending, because this now, from going to the D to the A, you're going higher up in the scale series, so the resolution is going to be different, because using this pattern, I'm resolving at the bottom of the horn, but now using this pattern, I'm going to resolve around the 5 instead of resolving back down to the 1, right? So kind of the direction of your patterns often is going to dictate what notes you're going to resolve in. And that's where you get into jazz about voice leading and such, and about trying to find intervals or notes in the scale or triad that you want to pinpoint, right? So this D minor 7 pattern using this motif would be really good if there was ever a time in the song or any song that I wanted to resolve on the 5 of the G, wherever I wanted to resolve on the G. And you'll see why here. So I'll play this one first. See, that goes back down and resolves to the 2, back down to D really well. Now if I play this one, see, it resolves back down to the 5 really well. But you can also take it somewhere else if you choose. There, I resolve back down to the 7, to B. It's wherever you want to go, but certain chords will obviously lead into other ones better, depending on the notes that you're ending them with, right? So again, you can always get more specific, but then you also have to keep in mind, this is something that is not expressed very often in jazz theory or jazz education, is that everything you do is going to have a particular sound to it, So, learning a bunch of Charlie Parker or Coltrane techniques is great, but if you don't want to sound like Charlie Parker or Coltrane, then you need to work on something else. You have to identify what kind of sound you're after and what techniques will correlate to that sound and that style. That being said, let's take a look at the E7 triad and how it's adapted to this lick. So I've got it written out here, and I'll play it for you. Now, one thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned in the last video, this E7 is a prominent chord in Autumn Leaves because of the G sharp it presents in harmony. That G sharp makes the A minor scale turn into the A harmonic minor scale, which adds a great amount of tension to the song. Now that's something that you can start to incorporate and play with in your improvisation. That G sharp is centered around the chord E7. So I'll play it for you here and we'll see how it sounds. There I chose to resolve on the E. I'll do a couple of different resolutions here. That was a resolution to G sharp. Resolution back down to E. So, as you can see again, in very many ways you can end these things. I mentioned briefly earlier about voice leading, and that would be a thing to do. To take this kind of concept the next step further, what you would want to do is figure out which note at the end of the series of the sequence or motif is going to naturally carry on to the next chord. You see, so the last note of your chord could be the third of the next note, right? So that's where the voice leading part comes in. So taking this further, that'll be the next thing that we look at. I hope this clarified how to use a motif or sequence on a chord change. Thanks for watching.